Good evening. My name is Bernard Sanders. The purpose of this program is twofold. First and primarily, we are going to examine an aspect of Vermont life that is not often seen on television, either commercial or public. We are going to be looking at poverty in Vermont, the economic misery, totally unnecessary in my view, that is grinding down the lives of tens of thousands of Vermonters in every area of our state. Secondly, we're going to briefly discuss Vermont Educational Television, this station, and strongly suggest that Vermont ETV undergo a major transformation so that it begins to become relevant to the low-income and working people of this state who constitute the vast majority of our population, but who presently watch ETV very rarely. During the course of the next hour, we're going to meet a number of Vermonters from throughout the state. We'll be talking to Tim Bates, an economist at UVM, who will inform us that the economic situation in Vermont for low-income and working people is far worse than Montpelier or the business interests allow us to know. We'll be talking to several members of the Abnaki Tribal Council who live in Franklin County, and they'll be telling us about the living conditions there. We'll meet residents of the Franklin Square low-income housing project in Burlington, and some women from central Vermont who are valiantly trying to maintain their human dignity while living on welfare. We will be talking to Ralph Underhill, an associate professor of sociology at the University of Vermont. Ralph, who was active in several low-income organizations, was recently denied tenure by the university for his political activities, something not unusual at the University of Vermont. In the state of Vermont, in the year 1979, incredible as it may seem, 20% of our adult population are functionally illiterate. Marty Majoris, who works with the Adult Basic Education Program in Winooski, will briefly discuss functional illiteracy with us and what it means to be a functionally illiterate worker. Sandy Baird, a deputy state's attorney for Chittenden County, and John Franco, a public defender for Chittenden County, who every day find themselves at the opposite end of the table in court, will explain what it means to prosecute and defend the people who break the law in the state, the vast majority of whom are poor. John Gale is a folk singer from Orange County, and he'll be singing for us tonight a well-known ballad of the American labor movement called Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a union organizer and songwriter who was murdered by the state of Utah in 1915 because of his work on behalf of striking miners. Sarah Seidman is a writer for the Washington World, a weekly newspaper in Montpelier. Sarah will be reading for us part of an obituary she wrote a couple of weeks ago for a neighbor of hers, a very ordinary Vermonter who we should know something about. Gene Bergman is a member of the steering committee of PACT, a low-income organization in Burlington. Gene will be telling us about the work that PACT is doing in such areas as housing, and how they are attempting to bring working people together to fight for their common interests. Jim Buckley is a resident of Middlesex, and he'll be speaking briefly about Vermont Educational Television, what it is doing, and what it's not doing, and what it should be doing. And if you're still here at the end of the program, I'll be back for a few words of summary. This is Ruth Billings. Ruth, you're a volunteer worker at the Old North End Food Co-op here in Burlington.
Right.
Ruth, recently the federal government has made some changes in the food stamp program affecting low-income families. Can you tell us what effect that's had on your family and on other families?
Real bad. I got cut from $131 to $48 a month. And with winter coming on with the oil prices, I don't know how we're going to make it, because our income hasn't changed. We're on disability, Social Security.
You got cut from $131 to?
$48.
And what was the justification for that? How do they expect you to live on the difference?
No, they don't care. I mean, they just told me that that was a new regulation. They couldn't do any different.
Tim, Governor Snelling has been telling us that the Vermont economy is booming for the last few years. The things are really looking good for the people of Vermont economically. As an economist at the University of Vermont, what's your assessment of the economic situation here in the state?
Well, actually, I'd say that the economic situation in Vermont is dismal. First of all, Vermont is one of the only two states in the country that's experienced a rising incidence of poverty in the 1970s. The only other state in the country that's seen poverty actually increase is the state of Illinois. Well, beyond those at the bottom of the economic heap, let's look at the median income of Vermonters, of all Vermont households.
Okay.
Now, in the 1970s, once again, Vermont is 49th in the country in terms of family median income keeping pace with inflation. In other words, in Vermont, we see that incomes are lagging behind inflation decisively, and not just at the national average. Connecticut is the only state in the United States that is lagging further behind the rate of inflation.
Now, what you're saying is that the standard of living for the average Vermont family, because of inflation, is actually declining. The people now are worse off in many ways than they were 10 years ago. Is that true?
That's true. Question is, what's wrong? Now, if you look at the unemployment rate in Vermont presently, the unemployment rate is 5.4% of the labor force.
That's what the official statistics indicate.
Right. That's actually an improvement, say, from 1974, before our last major recession. So what is wrong? I mean, what's the crux of the matter? Why is Vermont lagging behind so decisively? I look at job creation. And here we get to some of Governor Snelling's optimistic figures. Since August of '74, we've seen over 40,000 new jobs created in the state. Now, what kind of new jobs are being created? Is it manufacturing jobs? Are they stable, well-paying jobs? Well, manufacturing jobs have grown, but they account for only 6,800 of those new jobs. The bulk, 33,000 of these new jobs, are heavily concentrated in very low-wage, unstable lines of work, particularly service work, but also retail work. And it's this proliferation of low-wage, unstable jobs that is really characteristic of the problems that Vermont is having today. Now, let's go back to '74 again, before we created these 40,000 new jobs. You find that the average hourly earnings in the United States overall, $4.43 an hour. Vermont lags behind. The average wages here are $3.82 an hour. It's a 61 cent an hour gap for Vermonters. But by 1977, that gap had widened. We're 88 cents per hour behind the national median in hourly earnings. It simply reflects the fact that our real growth in employment is in low-wage, unstable areas. And within the service sector, actually the most rapidly growing job category is in tourism.
Low-wage, ski areas, the summer and the winter.
Right. This is actually lower than the average service job. It is the lowest paying, least stable type of work, and this is the type of job that is growing very, very rapidly. It gives us a number of Vermonters who are working poor, or working borderline poor. They are not outside of the labor force entirely. They are underemployed. They are earning a wage that is not reliable throughout the year, and when they are at work, it is abysmally low.
You mentioned to me before a statistic that if somebody, which wouldn't in fact be the case, but was working in the tourist industry for 4 seasons, for the entire year, what would their income come out to be?
If somebody was working year-round in the tourist industry, our most recent figures indicate that the wage would total about $5,000 a year.
$5,000 a year.
But that is an overestimate, although that's barely a poverty wage, because very few tourist jobs are year-round jobs.
Okay, Tim, let me jump to another point. You mentioned before that the unemployment statistic is approximately, the official statistic that we hear is 5.5%. Is that in fact the true statistic?
Well, the 5.5% unemployment rate reflects the federal government's measure of how many people are out of work. Now, that's a rather political figure, and I believe that it is biased downward to really conceal, to deliberately conceal the severity of the unemployment problem. Say, for example, that you're employed 30 minutes a week, and you're looking for work. Are you employed or are you unemployed? 30 minutes a week, an hour a week, 2 hours a week, you're counted as employed. Even if you are seeking a job, you are not counted as unemployed. Say you're earning no wages at all, but you're helping out on the family farm or whatever. If you're working 14 hours a week for no wages at all, even though you're looking for work, you're counted as employed. Beyond that, another category that's important is called the discouraged worker category. People know that in their region there are presently no jobs, so they are not actively seeking work. When work comes available, they start to seek jobs. Now, those people are not counted as unemployed. They're counted as not in the labor force.
Right.
And this is a very substantial number of people in the Vermont economy. Those are our two big gaps. People who are working very, very little, perhaps for zero wages, and people who are classified as not in the labor force because they are waiting for seasonal work to come available. I guess that if you considered these people with very little work, in addition to the so-called discouraged worker who is not looking for a job this week but who is unemployed, my guess would be conservatively that the true unemployment rate in the state of Vermont is a good double the 5.4% official rate.
All right, so when people hear an official statistic from Washington about unemployment in Vermont, they should double that in their own minds, easily. You're saying is that despite Mr. Snelling's assertions and other people's assertions, the state of our economy is poor and the situation is not getting better. In fact, it's getting worse.
The long-term trend is worse and the short-term trend is more dismal than that. Right now we're riding on the peak of an economic expansion. 4 years of steady economic growth, 40,000 new jobs in the state of Vermont, and at this peak, at this pinnacle of our prosperity, that's the situation.
And once again, let's reemphasize, the bulk of those new jobs are close to minimum wage jobs.
Right.
That's slave labor jobs.
Right. But I expect that in the near term, by late 1979, Vermont will enter a recession, and even those low-wage jobs will stop being created at such a rapid rate. Good. So the short-term prospect is even more dismal than the long run.
Okay, Professor Bates has talked to us about poverty in Vermont in a general view from an economist's point of view, and we're very pleased to welcome to our program tonight two gentlemen from the Abnaki Tribal Council, Richard Phillips from Highgate Springs and Abner Jerry from Swanton. And we have very little time, and I want to ask you some very direct questions. You heard Professor Bates talking about poverty in a general sense. What's happening to the Abnaki people up in the Swanton area?
Well, right now we're into a crisis with the younger people and even the older people. Jobs are over 50% unemployed or underemployed, and lack of permanent or long-term employment. Education, average level of 8th grade, so it makes it quite rough for the younger.
All right, what you're saying is that half of the people of the Abnaki tribe have no jobs.
That's true.
Okay, and what about education?
Education, on the average, it's 8th grade, you know, and they got to take a pickaxe and shovel job, which would be underpaid in the first place, you know, minimum wage. And,
what kind of $3 an hour jobs up there?
About $3 an hour jobs, and summer jobs, you know, they just don't work long enough, and they don't work out long enough to even draw unemployment, you know. And like myself, I'm not ashamed to say it, I'm on welfare. I can't find work. And I mean, even if I found a summer job, which wouldn't do me too much good because I wouldn't have the weeks in for unemployment. And if I dropped off welfare right now, I'd be really hurting by winter because I wouldn't be able to draw welfare again without the working quarters. You need 4 working quarters. And I think that applies to my, to the biggest share of the Swanton area people in Franklin County, that there just ain't enough employment.
And this, by the way, is not even just among the Abnaki. This is among whites as well.
Amongst the whites also, or any race. And I think, like Mr. Bates, what he was talking about, inflation is really taking over, you know, and more so, and I think in the state of Vermont than anywhere in the country, outside of South Carolina or out in the South out there, they ain't. I hear their unemployment it's way down too. It's way up.
How are people getting by? What are they doing?
Well, most of the people that's married and have children, like I do, I've got 6 children, and I'm living on welfare, and I can't see, you know, foreseeing jobs that they could cover as much as I make on welfare, you know. I can't go out and take a summer job and say, look, I got it made because I'm working and I get a summer job.
Oh, let me ask, what's the housing situation like up there?
Well, that's inadequate. Like my own self, I live in a house, it's a wooden frame home. And I don't have water there. I don't have the means.
You do not have running water?
No, I do not.
Is this common up there?
Well, right now what I'm doing is working on my water is what's little money I get at the time I put into material.
What I mean is, you're not the only person up there, I expect, without running water.
No, there are quite a few of them around that's in the same situation. I just bettered myself, believe it or not. I lived in a shack over on West Swanton Road, and I bettered myself by moving in this building. And this building here is all right itself, but I still don't have the water. I don't have the means to put water in. And, I mean, it makes it hard, you know, and before winter comes in, I got to try to get water. I know that, and it's a cost. And without work and me being on welfare, I can't see.
And when you're talking about these things, you're not just talking about yourself. This is
no, I'm talking about the Franklin County area people are worldwide, if you might say, you know, nationwide. And Mr. Jerry here, he lives in a trailer that's too small to live in, though. He can't even put a bed in his living room, in his bedroom, you know. It's really inadequate housing, and what we're trying to do now is to try to get something together We're trying to buy land, the Abenaki people are trying to buy land where we can have a community center.
Okay, gentlemen, I apologize very much for having to cut you off. But tonight we're going to be talking to people throughout the state whose problems in many ways are similar. We want to give the people of the state of Vermont a glimpse of what in fact is happening, which they never see. They're never allowed to see on the TV.
Yeah.
So I thank you very much for your presence here, and I apologize that you didn't have longer to...
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, my first question is, why are you sitting here with your backs to the camera?
My own personal reasons.
I've got 2 kids. I'm afraid of the repercussions.
What
I
do you
just
mean?
can't. Welfare, folk rehab. I'm afraid I'll lose my whole check.
Okay. What's going on?
Oh, I came to Vermont about 3 years ago through medical advice because they told me I had bronchitis bordering emphysema. I was then promised in the state of Vermont the same disability that I was getting where I came from. I then found myself on $42 a month and $58 for food stamps, having to rely on the charity of my friends.
Your total income then is less than $100 a month.
Yeah.
That's what you're getting and asked to live on.
Yeah.
So the only way you can in fact feed yourself and house yourself is by the charity of your friends.
No, I feed myself, but housing would be absolutely impossible for me. I was then sent to vocational rehabilitation. My first counselor was unbelievable. He was interested in my sex habits, and he later got fired. I was then given another counselor, sent 5 days of aptitude tests, which came out that I had electronic and technical arts ability. I was supposed to have a choice of 3 career opportunities and agriculture, none of which have been fulfilled. I've been given 2 contracts by vocational rehabilitation. Vocational rehabilitation is now aware that I have a transportation problem. They expect me on $42 a month, so they have $15 a week in transportation. I have now been promised schooling in October for a career I have absolutely no interest in whatsoever. But now the motto is, let's push Miss Davis into anything. I don't know if they'll fulfill that end of the contract in October. I have been sent to mental health numerous times in this state, and I don't know what's wrong with me mentally, so I don't feel I have that many problems, except I'm extremely depressed, and Vermont is slowly grinding me into the mud emotionally. I don't think I've lived in many states that I've ever seen what is called hospitality here, or the goings-on and the slight innuendos in any other state in the United States. I think Vermont slowly, emotionally destroys the poor to an extreme degree. I mean, myself, I feel every day I can sit down what's happening to me emotionally and just cry and cry and cry, and I've never been like that in my life. I don't feel I have any future, and I'm not that old. I don't feel any of this state will ever do anything for me except give me a bunch of bullshit promises and send me from psychiatric center to psychiatric center when I feel that I'm more mentally aware than many of them that are walking around in their white-collar jobs. I've been sent to Cedar, who tells me I'm too educated for manual labor jobs. I've been on Cedar for a year and a half, and they've never placed me. They know I have severe bronchitis and asthma, and yet they send me to sawmill jobs. I just feel that no one at this point that says they're interested in me gives one bloody shit. And I don't feel that only takes me in. I think that takes into many people that are in this position here.
Thank you. What's your situation?
My situation is twice a month I go to the mailbox. I collect my $401. I get my food stamps. That's for my month's allotment. I get 2 checks. I don't see where my future is. I'm with Voc Rehab. They don't want to spend any money on me. The same situation as her. I've been down for a week of testing at Allied. I'm not an idiot. I'm not a moron. I have a high intelligence. They say there's no schooling available for the things I'm qualified for. Of course, I qualified for 20 things, but they say there's no school, and they had a cutback of $200,000, so here I sit. I had a nervous breakdown 3 years ago. I don't know if they hold out any hope for me, but I don't see a way out of my situation. I'm unskilled labor. I can't possibly make any more at any job I could get now.
I mean, the amount of money that you would make working
That's right.
is less than you
It
get
would
on
be
welfare.
less than I get on welfare. And I'd lose my food stamps and my medical card, which doesn't provide for 2 kids too amply.
Where have you lived your 29 years?
I've lived within a 50-mile radius of Barrie. I've been on assistance ever since my divorce about 5 years ago. I'm with Voc Rehab. I'm with CETA. I'm
What
with
is CETA
WIN.
doing for you?
I filled out an application. They said I was eligible. I haven't gotten a call yet.
What about WIN?
WIN sent me, it was a 2-week thing. They told me to go out and apply for jobs, which I did. I haven't worked for 7 years. The only job I ever had was pumping gas. I don't see that that's any more of a future than what I have now. And I'm not going to hold my head up and be any prouder of myself, because I'll have even less. With deductions and everything, I'm still in the same hole. And I still won't be able to get any credit anywhere. I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. I thought it was Voc Rehab, but it apparently isn't. Not for me. Not in Vermont.
In the north end of Burlington, Vermont, there is a low-income housing project called Franklin Square. And tonight we're very happy to welcome to our show 3 people who live in Franklin Square. John Bartlett Jr., Carl Bilodeau, and Dick Sartell. Franklin Square has about 60 tenants, 60 houses, and about 250 kids. And gentlemen, last night when we were over at Dick's house, we were talking, you guys were telling me some rather astounding facts about the project, which I think the people of the state of Vermont should learn, and I'd like to just mention them, then we can discuss it. Number 1, it was your estimate that 9 out of the 10 kids in Franklin Square did not graduate high school. They're dropouts. Number 2, you told me that of the 250 kids in the project, you estimate that about 30 of them are either in jail, on probation, or in special homes such as the Wilderness Camp in Benson. Number 3, you told me that to the best of your knowledge, not one kid from that project has ever gone to college, maybe with the exception of a fellow who went for 3 weeks. And number 4, that drugs and alcohol are a major problem there, as there are among kids throughout the state. What's going on in Franklin Square? Dick?
Well, you have to take Franklin Square and consider the fact that you've got 60 units, 250 children, all condensed in a 3-acre area. It's a very depressing place. There's not much in the way of encouragement there. It seems like it's a place where it was built for low income and then set aside and forgotten about. There is no means of recreation. There's no means of improvement. There's no initiative. It's from the outside, if you go into the project, you get the impression that it is a real low-income place.
A ghetto is the word that you use.
The ghetto is the word that is used by the people that operate it. We feel, in fact, it's a joke among the people there that there's a north side ghetto and a south side ghetto. It just offers, for the amount of children and the amount of things there, anything for them to seek or initiative to move ahead. It just seems that everything there is self-esteemed. They do it themselves.
Okay. Carl, we're going to have to move fast, and we only have a few minutes. Carl, you're 20 years old. You have already had numerous brushes with the law. I think you just came from the public defender's office this afternoon, right? And what's going on among the young people in Franklin Square? Why is there so much law breaking and so forth?
Well, your major problem is alcohol, as far as I'd say, if you get into the drug category. Marijuana isn't that much of a problem, really. You do have a lot of police harassment. You get a group of kids, and they're trying to break up the group of kids. They're going to get a couple of kids, they're going to get mouthy. And somebody's going to get busted or hassled, and later on is going to be recouped. Broken windows, what have you, you know. Cop car is going to come through, it's going to get stones thrown at it. Why? Because the kid's going to remember what happened to him.
I mean, it's a vicious circle. The cops mistreat the kids.
When they drive in there, they feel they're looking for somebody to hassle, bust, or whatever.
All right, let me ask you this. How do the kids there feel? Does any of them, I mean, the figures that I read off here are pretty discouraging. Are kids optimistic about the future? Are they looking forward to the future?
Well, they're looked down on by the community, by North Avenue. I mean, North Avenue, you have all high-income houses, people that work at IBM, GE, and all this. And then you got Franklin Square, which is right in the midst of them, and you're going to school with these kids, and you look down on all this time. I mean, you do try to get by in school like I did. I had to get thrown out in 9th grade and obtain my GED, unfortunately, in jail. And if you want to do it, you have to do it yourself. You have to get out and do it yourself, because they will not help you. I mean, when they threw me out of school, they just really they just wanted me out of the system, finally.
That's happening to a number of kids in Franklin Square, is that true? Who are being tossed out of the... John, you've coached Little League and so forth. What's your observations of Franklin Square?
My observation this first year that, you know, that we've had this many children into, you know, Farm League, T-ball, Little League, is something that's starting to have something to do for a change and not having to take and hang around the streets all the time.
Is that prevalent? Do a lot of the kids just hang around doing nothing?
Hang around doing nothing, and kids come up, hang around and say, we're bored, we've got nothing to do. So what else is there for them to do but get into trouble?
You venture out into the project, and you're in somebody else's territory. You see, you're in the high-class district. So what can you do? You stay in your 3 acres. You see, and it's just constant destruction, just for something to do. See, run from the cops for something to do.
And it's fun.
Yeah.
Well, watching
I mean,
TV,
they've shot up our hope so many times. They're going to build a park in the backwoods. They got us all out there one day. We had a big picnic, helped them cut down a tree so much. They got all this money approved for the $1.2 million or whatever for the place. And next thing you know, the money comes up. Where is it? Nobody knows where it is.
Never happened.
Never happened. Blueprints, they paid surveyors, all this, blueprints. It was in the newspaper, what happened, nothing.
You take, I don't think the problem is so much what the kids want to do, but is what is expected of them. You find that people look down and have set a label upon them. They're low income, automatically, they come from troubled neighborhoods when they moved in. And they've had trouble since they've been there. It'll never get better, it gets worse. They live on promises. This is one thing that is great about project-type living. You're given $1 million promise and a 10-cent coffee.
All right, with that, I'm going to have to cut you off and apologize that we can't talk longer. And I thank you very much for telling us a little bit about life in Franklin Square.
Glad to be here.
Sandy Baird is a deputy state's attorney in Chittenden County. John Franco is a public defender in Chittenden County. Welcome to the program. It's common knowledge, Sandy and John, that the vast majority of people who are prosecuted by the law and who end up in jail are poor people. This is true nationally. This is true in the state of Vermont. Tonight, we've heard from Tim Bates, who's an economist, who has told us about the rather dismal economic conditions in the state of Vermont. We've heard from low-income people who are living the dismal economic conditions in the state of Vermont. And my question to you, who day after day are in court, is, isn't there an enormously strong element of futility in the work that you're doing, in the sense that the people you're prosecuting today often will be back in 6 months charged with the same crimes, who are going out into the streets with no jobs, going to jail, who are coming back again? That's my question. Sandy?
Yes, I would agree with that analysis, particularly for economic crimes. Crimes like insufficient funds or bad checks, or crimes involving driving under suspension, which often involves failure to pay fines, and so a person's license is suspended. For those kind of crimes, they will be repeats because people simply don't have the money to survive, and they'll do anything to survive. Driving, for instance, involves the ability to work, so people will keep driving no matter if they're suspended or not. For those kinds of crimes, jail does not help at all. The same with bad checks and other economic crimes like retail theft, which is shoplifting.
Is
in your work as a prosecutor, is that most of the work that you're doing is prosecuting people for breaking and entering and so forth?
I would say most of the crimes that we prosecute probably have to do with economics. There are other crimes that don't. For instance, violent crimes against people, which I don't think has to do with economics. And for that, I think prosecution probably does help. But jail can be punitive. For economic crimes, though, I don't see that there is much hope for that, for those rates getting better.
What you're saying is jail is not an answer to a poor person.
Right. I wouldn't say jail is an answer, right?
John, you're on the other side.
Well, the first thing we do in our office, Bernie, is we have to look at whether or not the person has a legal defense, whether or not the person is falsely accused, and we start from there. However, a lot of what we do is really social work. We get a person that's caught in the act, say in a burglary. Usually there'll probably be a 16, 17-year-old kid. And part of what we do is, if they've got them red-handed, we've got to kind of give them a shave and a haircut, try to clean them up, get them a job, get them a good place to live, and so forth, and make them look a whole lot better to the judge when we go in for disposition than they looked when they came in at arraignment. The problem is that you tell your client, well, if you want to stay out of jail, get a job, what kind of jobs are available? McDonald's, if they're lucky. Oftentimes, not even McDonald's. A lot of these kids are 9th, 10th grade educations, rotten home lives, violence in the home, alcoholism. They're on drugs or they have alcohol problems. And you're really running up against an enormous grain that you really have to cut across. Sometimes we're successful in the narrow sense of the word that the client doesn't come back, doesn't get involved with a law again. But I think in a larger sphere of things, given the larger perspective that what we're really doing is breakdown maintenance, it's going to be really interesting to me, since I'm kind of new to the criminal justice system, to see what the judges are going to recommend to people when, the recession really hits and we're looking at 15 or 20% unemployment. How do you have a person before you as a judge and say, how come you don't have a job when 15 or 20% of the nation is out of work? It really is an uphill battle, and I think in the long run, the criminal justice system, is absolutely incapable of really dealing with the causes of the problem. I sometimes think really unwilling. I think society sometimes wants to sweep the problem under the rug by putting people in jail. It's out of sight, out of mind, and they really don't want to deal with the causes. If they wanted to deal with the causes, then they wouldn't spend $12,000 a year to incarcerate somebody at the correctional center. They would spend that $12,000 a year on education and housing. We won't do that. We'll spend it on jails. We won't spend it on housing and that kind of thing.
Sandy, from your vantage point, how do you feel about what John just said?
I certainly agree that crime seems to be associated with poverty, and that putting a person in jail for a crime that is connected with poverty seldom solves any problems, particularly in the long run. This is also repeats in the same families. If it's a poverty family, you see 2 and 3 kids coming from the same family committing the same kinds of crimes. It's something that they learn, whereas if they had money, perhaps that just wouldn't happen.
Okay. Would I be correct in assuming that you see no improvement in the crime situation so long as economic conditions remain the same?
No improvement, at least in economic crimes, no. I can't see any at all.
John?
Well, one thing I want to point out is that Vermont doesn't have any kind of a crime problem like New York City, any of the urban areas. Another thing that people should be aware of is I think the situation in Burlington is radically different from the rest of the state. The context in like St. Albans or Middlebury or Barre, I think, is pretty much a rural setting. In Burlington, it seems like we have more criminal activity that is kind of in the same neighborhood as the stuff you see in the cities, more B&Es, more street crimes. But I really think that if we have a recession, you're really going to see the crime rate go up again. I think fundamentally it's not even a kind of a mechanical question of somebody being hungry and wanting to go out and steal. I think that a lot of these kids, and the really young kids that are involved in this stuff, are just really alienated. They strike out. They don't have a job. They don't have a place to go. And so what do? Maybe they're bored. Maybe they want to, get a cop angry and they go out and commit a B&E or something like that. So
I think I'm the juvenile prosecutor, and that's what I see mostly are kids who commit crimes. And to me, the biggest reason that they commit crimes is what John is talking about, is that is alienation, that they feel that society's offering them nothing, and they strike back in anger against it. I would never justify that kind of feeling. However, if they feel hopeless about their futures, they don't feel they belong in the society, that they're not going to have a job, there's no reason to be educated, there's no reason to do anything, that often results in the vandalism we see in the schools and in the streets. It often results in a lot of dope, a lot of alcoholism that leads to further crimes, too.
Okay, I apologize for having to cut you both off. We can go on for an hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Marty Majoris works for the Adult Basic Education Center in Winooski. Marty, according to the Department of Adult Education, 20% of Vermont adults are functionally illiterate. Now, I'd like to ask you two questions. First, what is functional illiteracy? What does that mean? And second of all, how does a functionally illiterate person survive in the year 1979?
I think functionally illiterate refers to a lot of people who may have difficulty finding a name and address in a phone book, reading road signs, finding street signs, filling out application forms. Those are some of the things that people take for granted that other people have a lot of difficulty with. I think what happens with many people today in 1970 who are functionally illiterate, one of the characteristics of their life, I think, is lack of control. Lack of control, you know, perhaps they don't know directions to some place. They have to ask someone else. They have to rely on other people.
Well, it seems to me, in terms of jobs, this must make somebody totally economically dependent, overjoyed to take any kind of job at any wage at all. Would you say that's true?
I think that's true. I think a lot of people don't, well, are unable to fill out applications. It's then scary to go to some place of employment to try to fake filling out an application. It's very nice then when they can get any kind of job. It's a relief. And it limits them. You know, it just limits them. They are not going to apply for certain jobs where they have to be faced with 5 or 6 interviewers, you know, and a resume and things like this. You won't do it.
So does that mean then that functionally illiterate people, I would assume that that means that are working for the minimum wage in the lowest kind of jobs and are totally dependent on employers for any kind of existence at all. Is that correct?
I think that's true, that a lot of people that I've met are working as janitors, as waitresses, and besides just working for a minimum wage, are not totally aware or don't have the confidence to fight an employer in a way, if necessary, to stand up for what is their right in an employment situation.
Scared to death of being thrown out and not being
Besides the minimum wage, there's also another emotional and kind of psychological factor involved also, I think.
Hi, my name is John Gale Moore, and I live in South Washington, Vermont, and I sing and play music for a living. You know, a lot of people don't consider musicians to be workers. They consider them solely entertainers, people who are supposed to make workers and non-workers alike feel better about their lives and their jobs, and supposed to make them happy. But I consider myself a worker, although I love what I do better than anything else in the world. I am still a worker. It's not an easy life, but it's a totally enjoyable one. And I'd like to do a song called Joe Hill. It's about the martyr of the American labor movement. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man. Says Joe, I didn't die. Says Joe, I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they forgot to kill went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. From San Francisco to Vermont, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill.
Hi, my name is Sarah Seidman, and I work for the Washington County World newspaper in Montpelier. This is the house of a friend of mine who died a couple weeks ago. I'd like to share a eulogy I wrote for him in the paper. My friend Charlie died today. I can't face seeing his life condensed into an obituary, which will not tell people about the clear blue eyes that sparkled from his old, lined face, or his frequent, toothless grin. I never knew him when he was young and strong, though I heard many stories about his reputation as a hard and conscientious worker. When I knew him, he was already old and ill, with wispy white hair beneath his cap and the smell of old age about him. His complexion was pale, and he would gasp and pant if he had to walk more than a few steps. But his mind was as clear as those twinkling eyes. We would sit in this shack, and he would tell me stories about the many jobs he worked at through the years. He had helped haul dead animals for Maxim's in Worcester, dug graves for a Montpelier funeral home, cleaned the cages of vicious mink raised for their fur on giant farms. When he worked in Worcester, he would walk every day from here to there, more than 7 miles a day. And people learned to pick him up when they saw him walking toward Montpelier for his groceries. I don't think he ever had a car, or a phone, or running water for that matter, but I only knew him for a short while. He helped build the log cabin that is my home, dragged the logs from the woods with a team of oxen, peeled them and notched them and put them in place. I came to see him first as a new neighbor out of courtesy, but later my motive had become almost entirely selfish. He knew so much about the wildlife and woodlands of Middlesex and the people in the neighborhood. I began to learn about the changes he had seen in his day, once I learned to decipher his speech, which was garbled both by his lack of teeth and the large wad of tobacco he customarily held in one cheek. Once I knew that whack maple was the ones others called sugar maple, and butternut meant butternut, we would have long talks about the forest. He would walk slowly down the path between our properties and point out the trees and flowers so I could fix their characteristics in my mind. He was the one that suggested water bars to help save our rutted driveway. And he was the one who helped me learn about traditions I was too young and liberated always to understand. Why am I sad? He was old and ill, and his life was lonely and boring, with only the ever-blaring television and his small, yelping beagle for company. I miss stopping in to spend a few minutes with him. I wish now I had stopped more often. That's crazy, of course, for any of us to blame ourselves for what we all knew would happen sooner or later. I guess I'm not only sad for him, but for all the human lives that begin and end each day, for death itself as the final, incomprehensible paradox of our lives. Charlie Richardson wasn't an important man. The obituary will be short and indistinguishable from the notices of the deaths of other men and women who lived and died without performing the acts that are deemed important by the television world. Yet even in the 2 years I knew him, his courage and kindness in the face of loneliness and pain merited more than 30 words or so. I'm beginning to see that obituaries are only something to remind people of a face and personality in order to preserve the spirit of that human life a bit longer. In the hope that his story may inspire remembrance of a good and gentle man, and for all the good people whose lives are only memorialized through a quickly written, unemotional notice, I dedicate this time to Charlie Richardson, 72, a lifelong Vermont resident, who died at his Middlesex home on May 18, 1979.
PACT, which stands for People Acting for Change Together, is an organization made up of low-income and working people here in Burlington's North End. Gene Bergman has been a member of PACT for 5.5 of its 7 years. During the course of the 7 years of PACT's existence, it has waged a number of fights on behalf of low-income people in such areas as housing, employment, welfare, food stamps, police brutality, and so forth and so on. Gene, what's happening to the people here in the North End of Burlington?
Well, most of the people in the North End are working class people, and we're seeing that our whole standard of living is under attack. You've got large cutbacks in state funding for daycare, which affects working mothers and even parents and two-parent families. People that are on welfare, the different programs have seen that their checks have not kept up with this rampant inflation. And on top of that, for families that have got older children, that youth employment programs are sharply cut down, so that the number of kids that don't have jobs is a lot higher this year. On top of that, you know, you've got the low wages of Vermont and an incredible housing situation in this town, where rents are going for like $300 for, you know, 2-room apartments and 3-room apartments. People just can't afford it, and they're being pushed right out. So, do you see? We know that there's a tremendous housing shortage in Burlington. Do you see the landlords taking advantage of that situation? Without a doubt, there's profiteering and rent gouging and speculation. By and large, what's happening is that landlords are figuring that they can make a killing, and what they're doing is converting to smaller apartments, to condominiums, just selling out to the redevelopment process, and it's really screwing low-income people.
And how are people able to pay those rents?
They're not. They're moving out. They're moving to trailer parks, so that we have a housing program here. We see that we're getting a lot of calls from people having problems with trailers, because the number of low-income people moving into trailers just means that that housing situation is also getting tighter, and landlords are taking advantage of that also.
Okay, let me ask you this, Gene. We don't have a whole lot of time. PACT is involved in politics, of course. What political solutions do you see to these immediate problems that you're talking about, for example, with regard to housing?
Well, our number one priority that we've determined for this city is rent control. We feel that you've got to limit the amount of profits that a landlord can make in this situation, because what you're getting is wicked profiteering. So unless you do that, people are just going to be taken advantage of constantly. So that's the number one thing on our agenda.
Okay, can you explain, in case some of the viewers don't understand, what would rent control mean here in Burlington?
Rent control would mean that there would be, every time that a landlord would want to raise the rent, they would have to justify their cost, basically, so that they would have to show that their costs were increased, and they would have a certain profit level. We've set down an 8% above fair market value. It's a fairly complicated system, but basically what it does is make the landlords justify their rent increases, because right now all they're doing is raising them because they can get the money.
All right, now correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand the situation now, if landlord A says, if you're paying $150 a month now, landlord A could write you a letter and say, as of next month, your rent is $400 a month, pay up or get out.
That's right, without a doubt. What happens is that tenants who've been living in places for 16, 18, 20 years have had their rents raised $150 in the span of a month. And we have fought for a family on Pine Street that happened to. The landlord tried to get him out solely to speculate on the building, because it was right near the waterfront redevelopment area, and he could make thousands of dollars on it.
Am I also correct in understanding that a tenant really has very little rights? The landlord doesn't like the color of your hair and says, hey, well, my sister-in-law needs an apartment, get out. Does the tenant have any protection?
Very little protection in the form of against evictions and against rent hikes, which is a lot of things that you hear people talking about these days. There's no rent and eviction control. It's
okay,
really
Gene,
hard.
What I want to get to now is a basic question. You're involved with the enormous problems that people have here with regard to low wages, unemployment, housing, medical care, education. Do you see, based on your analysis of the situation and your work with people here, that the so-called free enterprise system is going to solve those problems?
Well, we've done a lot of thinking about this, and over the last few years we've tried to grapple with that question. What we've come up with is that we don't believe, our organization does not believe that a system that's based on solely making a profit for the owners of the businesses or the landlords can meet the needs of the people. And what we're calling for, what we do call for, is a system that puts people's needs first before profits. That's basically what our position is on that.
Gene Bergman, thank you very much. Ralph Underhill is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Vermont. During the last year, Ralph has been in the news often because of the fact that he was denied tenure by his department. Many people, including myself, feel that Ralph was denied tenure because of his political beliefs. Among his many activities is his work with a number of low-income organizations in Burlington. Ralph, it's a pleasure to have you.
Nice.
Ralph, what I would like to have you talk about very briefly is the University of Vermont. Given the fact that we live in one of the poorest states of America, and that the university itself is supposedly our intellectual center, do you think the University of Vermont is doing the job that has to be done in a state like ours?
Well, no, I don't. I mean, first, it's worth looking at how the university is run. I mean, it's legally owned by a board of trustees who are much like the board of directors of corporations. As a matter of fact, most of them are directors of corporations, or they're bankers, or they're lawyers for corporations, and they want it run just like any other business, and run for the benefit of the business community. And indeed, that's the way it is. That's the way it is run. The university's record in the town of Burlington and the state of Vermont is not a good one, as far as representing ordinary people is concerned. Represents the business community fine, but for instance, it's one of the largest employers in Burlington and in the state of Vermont, but it has a notorious anti-union record. The employees at the University of Vermont are among the lowest paid in the area, and it's just recently that the employees of Vermont ETB have succeeded in organizing the first union at the University of Vermont and successfully conducted the first strike there. The university resisted that effort as much as it could. And similarly, it's resisting an effort amongst its staff to organize a union. Another example is in the area of housing. There's a severe housing shortage in the Burlington area. And it's getting worse now, partly because of some companies coming in from Canada. The university just contributes to that housing shortage by refusing to build enough dormitory space for its students. It doesn't show any concern for the people of Burlington at all. Well, rents skyrocket in the Burlington area now. I would say that the university has been very irresponsible as far as its obligations toward...
Okay, let me ask you a quick question. How is it that teachers who seem to excite students, Parenti comes to mind, the number of people in the philosophy department, a fellow who was in the medical school a couple of years ago, those people who are young, who want to see things happen, how come it seems to be they don't last very long at the University of Vermont?
Well, I think for some of the reasons I was saying in the first place, I mean, the university is intimately tied to the business world and to the business community, and those of us who teach Marxist ideas or radical ideas represent a threat to the business community. I mean, we equip students to think in ways that the businessmen don't like them to think, and well, we also are politically active. You know, we do political organizing and stir people up to fight for their rights, and they don't like that.
My apologies in cutting you off.
Oh,
okay. Thank you very much for joining us.
My name is Jim Buckley, and I'm from Middlesex, Vermont. I'm concerned that ETV has been in existence for 7 years, and they only are broadcasting to 2 or 3% of the populace now, the viewing audience. And it seems a shame to me. They spend $1.5 million of taxpayers' money. They're in the field of television, but not like Channel 3 or Channel 8. This should be something that the people own and cherish, but I don't think the management at ETV has made any effort to do this. Some examples being, I've lived in 5 towns in Vermont, in rural areas, and I've never been able to get ETV. I've always been able to get, you know, the major networks and usually Channel 22. A few weeks ago, I had to spend $177 on a TV antenna just to get ETV. It seems unfair. It seems like they should make an effort to get their signal to the rural areas of Vermont. Then after getting it, I was interested in having a program. So I looked into it, and peculiarly enough, this is what it states in the program. It says, the Vermont Educational Television Program Guide is published monthly for members of Vermont ETV, those who contribute $20 or more. Well, I'm really...
Professionals. The potential of television to improve the quality of life in this country is enormous. Commercial television, as we know, is owned and controlled by corporate interests whose only concern is profit. It makes no difference how many times during the hour are interrupted by commercials. It makes no difference what the content of the programming is. The function of commercial television is only to sell profits and make money for the people who own the stations. Public television, however, is a totally different animal. Theoretically, at least, public television is owned by the people and is supposed to be working for the people for their own best interests. With regard to this station, it is my view that the University of Vermont, who currently holds the license for Vermont ETV, should no longer be allowed to hold that license and hold that important position. I say this because I think the history of the University of Vermont is such that it is clear that UVM is an institution which is dominated by business interests who are hostile to the needs of low-income and working people. It is my view that we would see a great improvement in the quality of programming here at Vermont ETV if the license was switched to a newly formed nonprofit organization which allowed democratic elections for the members of the governing body. As the economic situation in our country and in our state continues to deteriorate, as housing becomes virtually unobtainable, as the price of food goes up, as gasoline goes to $1 or $1.50 a gallon, it seems to me absolutely essential that if we are going to preserve democracy in this country and a decent standard of living, ordinary people are going to have to stand up and take responsibility for their own lives. No longer can they trust professors or UVM administrators. I think this station can play an important role in that process, and I hope it will. Thank you very much.
From San Francisco to Vermont, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find